Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the quarterly weather update and outlook by Jeff Lindner. I'm recording this session and we'll put it up on our YouTube channel. And I appreciate Jeff providing weather service that's sponsored by South Texas Cotton and Grain Association. So, Jeff, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thank you, sir. Appreciate it. Thanks for having me. Going to take a look at the outlook period from February through April of this year. And we'll get into some commentary on some of the stuff, but this is going to be some of the graphics and stuff, and then we'll talk a little bit about the forecast. So this is the rainfall departures for last year, 2023. We kind of had that wet-ish part of April, May, and the first part of June, and then the drought kind of kicked in, almost a flash drought, if you will, that came in with all the exceptional heat in the summertime, and then kind of lingered into the fall. We did start to see some improvement in the later parts of the month, but this is how we ended up. Very dry, exceptional drought conditions across Louisiana, back into southeast Texas, Beaumont, Port Arthur area, then kind of down along the coast toward the Matagorda Bay area. And then down into South Texas, again, not as bad as areas off to the north and northeast. A lot of that is due to the tropical storm that made landfall in August, which really helped Donald, which made landfall down there, which helped kind of intercede the dry periods there and really help those areas out. But you can see some areas there around Matagorda Bay, Wharton County, Matagorda County ended anywhere from 6 inches to as much as 10, 12 inches or even more below normal, and still really bad conditions over in Louisiana. And they're still trying to come out of those drought conditions in the state of Louisiana. Interestingly enough, we've kind of flipped in the last, I would say 10 days or so. This is the 60-day rainfall departure. A lot of this has fallen in the last 7 days or so. So you can see last week's rain show up very nicely here, especially in southeast Texas or from south central Texas, a kind of I-37, 281 corridor, north and east. Not as much rain down along the Rio Grande Plains, down in deep South Texas, but you don't get as much down in those areas versus some of the areas off to the north and east. So we're doing really well, if you will, for the first part of 2024 for January. This really helped pull a lot of areas that were still in drought out of those droughts, replenish a lot of the water supply, replenished a lot of the ponds and the stock tanks, and of course got the rivers up and going. We did have some flooding on some of the lower portions of the Brazos, the Colorado, the Tres Palacios, the Lower Guadalupe still in flood down in Bloomington. And so we got everything up and going, especially kind of north and east of the Corpus Christi area. So really kind of what we needed to replenish stuff. Now we need to kind of take a break. And I don't know if we will. It's kind of an active period, at least over the next 7 to 14 days. Another storm system comes in this weekend, which looks to produce another 1 to 3 inches of rain, especially in southeast Texas, maybe down toward the coastal bend, but kind of dry back toward the southwest. And that's kind of been the pattern we've seen, as a lot of these systems have been producing that rain up around the Victoria, Beeville, Matagorda Bay area, but not getting a whole lot back in the Rio Grande Plains. The storm track is just a little bit too far to the north to produce a lot of moisture back down along the Rio Grande Plains or in deep South Texas. So this is where we were. This was kind of the peak of the drought last summer, the kind of the flash droughts, and you can see huge areas of exceptional drought conditions. You can see Tropical Storm Donald there across south central and southwest Texas, kind of breaking the drought. And this is where we are as of last week. So you can see the dramatic improvements we've seen. A lot of this happening in December and January of this year. We still have some issues in central Texas, back down into southwest Texas. A lot of the rain this past week did not impact the Highland Lakes chain. So Lake Travis, Canyon Lake, Lake Buchanan, almost had zero responses from the rain last week. It all fell kind of east and south of I-35. Much of that water going into the rivers and running into the Gulf of Mexico. So Lake Travis is still down only at 38, 39% of its conservation pool. Canyon Lake, I think, is 60% of its conservation pool. So we're still in serious water supply conditions in the Highland Lakes and Central Texas area. So we desperately need some rain west of I-35 and the hill country in those areas to help replenish those water supply lakes. We do not want to go into the summer months with those lakes at the levels they're at. So hopefully we can get some rain out there If we just get the pattern to shift a little bit. Interestingly enough, you can still see a little bit of extreme drought there in East Texas. So even after all of the wetness, even after we have river flooding going on in East Texas right now, it just shows you the level of the drought that we were in last summer in the fall in East Texas. And Toledo Bend was down some 6 feet, which Toledo Bend is a massive water supply reservoir, and so to drop that lake that low, especially in the fall and winter months, is pretty impressive. But they're recharging that with the rains of the last week, and they should be back up to conservation pool as we get into later this week. So I always like to show this. This is really a fire weather product, but this just kind of shows you the depth of moisture in the soil. So the red colors, the 7 to 800, indicate there's no moisture down to 7 or 8 inches deep below the ground. And the blue colors indicate you can find moisture in that 0 to 200 to 2 inch range in below the surface. And so you can see most of Texas is doing really well with the rains of late. So we have near surface moisture. We still have a little bit of dryness, subsurface back down southwest of San Antonio, down towards Laredo, and then of course out in West Texas. But this is certainly what you want to look at as you're trying to come out with when you're trying to come out of drought conditions. So this means, generally speaking, most of those places in the green or the blue, additional rainfall is going to run off. The ground is saturated, so it's going to run off into those water supply conservation reservoirs and stuff like that. Still some room down to the southwest for it to soak in. Fire weather, obviously not big concerns right now. We've had enough rain over the winter that the conditions are decently fine. We still have some issues down in South Texas and Southwest portions, out along the Rio Grande Plains. Two reasons: not so much because of the dryness. There is some dryness still around the Laredo area, but it's a bigger deal with the freezes that we had the second week of January there. That has cured and killed the grasses. And so when we get these cold fronts that come through, and we get those strong northerly winds, the low humidity, those grasses will burn readily. So that is the fire weather concern, and we're going to probably deal with that until we see green up. Probably early March, late February, early March, coming up from the south. Once we start to see those fine grasses green up, we'll be doing a lot better with the fire weather situation, at least down in deep South Texas. The Rio Grande Plains out there on Laredo del Rio, they could still have some issues going into the spring if we don't see some wetting rainfall out in that area. That area still has some higher numbers of the fire weather index. All right, so let's talk about El Nino. I think the last time we talked was in October, and we were, looking at this strong-ish El Nino. So this would have been September of last year. The sea surface temperatures, you can clearly see the warm conditions there from the coast of South America westward out towards South of Hawaii. And I think there was a lot of hope that El Nino would produce the rains across Texas and the southern plains into the fall and wintertime. That tends to be a relatively strong correlation between an El Nino and wet weather in the southern plains in Texas. And it really hasn't happened. We certainly didn't see that in November and December, and even for the most part of January up until the last 10 days or so. And so, the question is the last 10 days kind of finally the pattern kicking in here where El Nino is controlling more of the weather? There are some indications that may be the case. If you look at what's getting ready to happen in California over the next week to 10 days, it looks very, very, very wet. One system after the other coming into the California coast. Does that get down here into the southern plains of Texas? Yeah, it looks like we do get a system this weekend, possibly another one next week. And so that would be more of an El Nino pattern for us. Just kind of every 3 to 4 days, we get a storm system through here that produces some rainfall. Up until this point, we really hadn't seen that. And there's some hypothesis of, why has the atmosphere really not transitioned to the El Nino? This is the current sea surface temperatures, and you can see there's still a lot of warm water down there at the equator. But if you look, there's not a lot of difference in the ocean temperatures between the equator and the northern latitudes. And so we have above normal ocean temperatures also in the North Pacific. Throughout the entire Atlantic, the Atlantic continues to be very warm. We're seeing a little bit more difference in the southern hemisphere, in the southern oceans. You can see the below average temperatures, if you will. And so there's some hypothesis that this El Nino hasn't coupled like we would normally see in an El Nino situation with the atmosphere because of these higher temperature anomalies in the northern oceans. I wouldn't rule it out. I don't know if it's 100% the reason, but this is one of the things we've been talking about over time and time again over the last few years is just how warm the oceans are. And so sometimes when you get these El Nino, it's not as disruptive because you have warm water in a certain area because you have warm water kind of everywhere. And that may be some case. It's certainly interesting. We'll see, people who look at that type of stuff, what they come up with. One thing I'll point out again is just look at that Atlantic. It is very, very warm. And this potentially is a harbinger of things to come with our hurricane season in 2024 if we don't cool that Atlantic down some. And there's no big indication right now that that's going to happen. So I typically show these again, the effects of El Nino and La Nina. We talk a lot about it, but it's really the effects are really only in the fall, winter, and early spring months. So we do not get effects from La Nina and El Nino in the summertime. So in the hot months of our year, this tends to be this time of year where we get the greatest impact from these from the warm waters or the cool waters in the Central Pacific. And again, this is your typical El Nino, cooler and wetter. January has been relatively cooler. A lot of that's because we had a couple cold days there in the middle of the month. And it's going to, if you look at it, it's going to end wetter because we had, a lot of rain in a 4 to 5 day period. But if you take that away, January would have ended drier. And so this is not sort of the typical El Nino that we'd be expecting, where you get, a half an inch of rain, you go a couple days, you get a quarter inch of rain, you get a lot of clouds and stuff like that. It really hasn't been that. The rain's kind of come in these big chunks, which is kind of interesting. That's what we're seeing. So you can see the temperatures throughout the Pacific still well above normal, well above the 1 degree, which indicates we have a fairly decent moderate to strong El Nino in place. We have started Nino 1 and 2. We have started to see some cooling there. That's right off the coast of South America. So if you imagine that kind of pool of warm water last summer was near the coast of South America, and it's kind of shifted westward out towards the Hawaiian Islands or south of the Hawaiian Islands. And so we're seeing those Nino 3.4, Nino 4 regions, which are further west, kind of reaching their peak right now, and kind of some cooling along the coast of South America. So this is kind of an indication that El Nino is not so much dissipating yet, but kind of transitioning from what we call a classic off the coast of South America to what we call a Marakai, which is the area south of Hawaii. And sometimes that can make a difference in the southern plains. Your traditional El Ninos, where it's very warm off the coast of South America, tends to be a warmer pattern and a wetter pattern for the U.S. East Coast, versus when the transitions further to the west, it tends to be a little bit wetter for the southern plains. So we'll see. Maybe we're starting to see some of that right now with the increasing rainfall. So this is the forecast. One thing I'll caution about, this is the time of year where these forecasts tend to not be as great. So between January and mid to late March, there's this kind of barrier in the forecasting for El Nino, that El Nino and La Nina, that gives models a little bit of trouble. And so, I don't put a lot of stock into this. As you saw, that it continues to be very warm out there. There hasn't been any big indications yet of a collapse of this El Nino, but the models show a spectacular collapse of this as we go into the late spring and early summer. Going back to neutral conditions, and then potentially even towards La Nina conditions by the summer. I don't know. I think that's pretty fast. There's a lot of warm water out there that would have to cool dramatically, and we'll see. So my thought right now is, given it's mid to late January and we're still this warm out there, the chances of us being at neutral by March or April seems low to me. So we'll see how this goes. And again, this potentially plays into our weather pattern as we get into the spring months. So this is the global guidance. This is the American guidance. And one thing that we've noticed, especially starting October, November of last year of 23, is that a lot of the big guidance began to back off of it being very wet in Texas. If you remember last summer, early fall, it looked wet. in Texas and the southern plains for this winter and into the spring. And really, ever since then, the guidance has been slowly backing away from that idea. And this has continued, and even in the southeastern United States, which El Nino tends to be very wet in the southeast United States, it's even backed away from it there. And so I think to some degree, the models may have caught on a little bit to this El Nino, maybe not as typical as it normally would, and seeing some of the normal anomalies that we see during these types of things. But it still is keeping with that pattern. Florida's wet, the Gulf Coast is wet, Southeast Texas looks potentially wet, and then kind of normal conditions, coastal bend, maybe even drier than normal down in South Texas. But there's these anomalies are not huge. So, if I had to put, anything on it, I'd say, you're plus or minus an inch or so on either side of the spectrum. You might be below an inch here, you might be above an inch here. That seems to be, kind of the way this is playing out. This is the European model. It has a little bit of a different aspect. It has a little bit of more of that traditional look. They're wet in the southeast, up the east coast, Gulf of Mexico, Florida. Not so much in the central and western Gulf, but it does have kind of a little bit of above average precipitation in Texas. Again, nothing striking, nothing standing out, screaming, big rains and anything like that. But, this would be maybe a little bit more rain back further west in Texas where we desperately need it. So, we'll see if that really is what happens. And then this is the Canadian, and it kind of shows, something similar to the American model a little bit further to the north, more of a typical El Nino pattern in the southeast. But again, nothing big standing out here in Texas. No big anomalies one way or the other. We could be a little bit above off to the east, a little bit below back to the west, but generally speaking, kind of near normal precipitation in the southern plains in Texas. So, I guess we'll take what we can get. And this is the model mean. This is all this put together. It's tending to lean a little bit drier. I don't know if I really believe it. I, I I I think this may end up being a little bit on. If I had to go with anything right now, I think it may end up being a little bit on the wetter side, especially the further east you are. So Matagorda Bay, Victoria, up to southeast Texas, maybe back towards Beeville. If you're down in Rio Grande Plains, South Texas, yeah, you may end up a little bit drier, but there's no big anomalies here. So there's no huge dryness. We're not talking 5, 6, 7 inches below normal. We're also not talking above average significantly. So kind of right around average, if you will, for the spring as we go forward. And this is the forecasters from the National Center up in DC. So kind of they put all this together and they actually come up with their own, kind of just what I said there, kind of, west or east of, I don't know, the Guadalupe River, kind of east of Victoria. Maybe some above average precipitation. The percentages are not great. We're talking 33 to 40% chance of it being above average. So that's not a huge, percentage. And then kind of near normal back down toward the west. Unfortunately, that's where we need a little moisture, especially down in the Laredo Del Rio area. It's kind of hard to get out of drought when you're not getting consistent moisture. So we'd like to see a little bit more down there. But this isn't a big drought redeveloping type thing for Texas or anything like that. It kind of is a status quo, near normal type conditions. All right, let's talk about temperatures. And the trend you're going to see here is just hot, above average. Really, this is a very classic El Nino, very warm up in Canada and a little bit cooler down along the Gulf Coast. This isn't necessarily because we're getting a lot of cold air. It's mainly because we have the precipitation and the cloud cover, if you will, and you kind of see the same thing, especially showing up in the European there, the southern states, from the southwest right through the southeast, near normal temperatures. And again, that's more of a function of it being cloudy and wetter than actually big cold coming down. And so you kind of see the same pattern here over and over again. So I think our temperatures, generally speaking, near normal-ish as we go into much of the fall. Interestingly enough, the National Center has a little bit of below normal back to the south and west, and West Texas and the kind of near normal for the rest of the area. I think the question is, how much precipitation do we get and keeping the soil moisture and all that? And I think that looks pretty good. One thing I do want to talk about is there are some indications in February, mid to late February, of some of the pattern aloft, kind of going back to what we saw in mid January. So the potential for cold air, potentially Arctic air to come south again down the plains. We're pretty far out. You know, we're talking something that's three-ish weeks away. Um, Interestingly enough, the models did pretty well with that January Arctic outbreak that we got. Really far out. They got the blocking right. They got the kind of the cold air right. The question was, you know, was that cold air coming down the plains, or was it going to go more towards the East Coast? And in fact, it did come down the plains, and we got cold for a couple of days. And again, those are the same questions we're going to, you know, look at in February. Does this come straight down the plains? Does it go more to the east? Does it even happen? You know, just because, you know, things were right and everything was great and wonderful in January doesn't necessarily mean the models have a good grasp on what's coming potentially in February. But I do want to put it out there because generally speaking, this is a mild forecast for us, but there potentially is a period of cold from mid February 14th, 15th on into the early part of March. And you know, that comes with a whole lot of questions. Are we talking freezing? Are we talking below freezing? Are we talking below freezing for daytime highs? Is it cloudy? Is it clear? There's just all kinds of potential you know, avenues there of how cold potentially we get down in Texas. The good news is once we tend to get past mid-February, it's rare for us to get big cold, but it can happen. We can have freezes into March, and so I just want to put that out there that there are some indications as we get into mid to late February of some colder conditions coming down, and we'll just have to see what that comes with. Does it come with clouds and precipitation, which kind of mutes the cold? So you get a lot of days in the, you know, daytime highs in the 40s, nighttime lows in the 40s. You know, there's not a big variation in the temperature. Does it come with clear skies, or does it come with a period of clear skies where we can get cold at night because we radiate everything out? Kind of like what we saw in January there. So we'll just have to see. I put that out there. Keep an eye on it. Obviously, we'll be talking about it as it gets a little bit closer. But right now, it's just way far out there to make any real deterministic anything on what the temperatures look like mid to late February. So this is the drought outlook, and we've seen, you know, a lot of improvement. I think this is a little bit over aggressive, especially west of I-35, in the hill country. We still have drought conditions in that area. We desperately need water in those water supply lakes. And so hopefully the pattern here over the next month or two gets us rain back from Del Rio, Laredo, San Antonio, Austin, those areas to really help with the conditions in that area. And then we get that kind of consistent rainfall as we go forward. And that's kind of what it looks like, at least for the next, you know, 7 to 14 days, especially north and east, Victoria, Matagorda Bay, Beeville, those areas. South and west, unfortunately, it looks like you might get kind of missed again by these storm systems kind of going a little bit further off to the north. But going forward, you know, the tendency here is for drought relief, not drought development in southern Texas, south central Texas, and even down into South Texas. And so we'll just have to see how things plan out. You know, February and March tend to be our drier months of the year. So if we can get some decent rainfall, at least a couple inches of rainfall during that time, that will go a long way in helping continue to beat back the drought conditions, which we really don't have now. We have kind of near normal conditions. And so, generally speaking, the outlook, El Nino likely to peak here in the next month or two, and then we'll see how dramatically it falls. You know, if you look at the models, it falls dramatically to almost nothing by summer. We'll see if it's really going to be that quick of a fade away, because that has big implications for our hurricane season in 2024 if it does fade away that quickly. Again, near normal rainfall. I think you'll be a little bit drier, maybe a little bit below normal down south and west, to potentially a little bit above normal up north and east. So kind of what we've seen all winter. The same kind of pattern continues to play out here. I would say if the atmosphere does kind of couple with El Nino and we get into a more El Nino pattern, we're definitely going to have to keep an eye on April and May for maybe some bigger rains. That tends to be when we can get some big rains in these types of patterns, and so we'll just have to see if that El Nino situation couples more with that atmosphere, and we get that moisture and everything to come together later in the spring. I don't necessarily see that happening as much here in February and March. This tends to be kind of our cool season, so we don't get the big rains. Although last week some places got almost a foot, and so we'll just have to see. If we continue to see those types of storm systems into the later spring, we could get some much bigger rains in Texas as the temperatures warm up. Again, generally above average temperatures through the period, but there could be some spells of cold air in there, especially mid to late February into early March. And that potential there is kind of a longer duration cold. I'm not saying we're going to be below freezing for 2 weeks, but the cold hangs around. It looks like it kind of hangs around a little bit. So it's not a quick hit. It's in 3 or 4 days and out of here. It could be multiple fronts coming down and kind of lingering that coolness into the first part of March. And again, we'll just have to see how cold potentially we get during that period. And then generally speaking, near average soil moisture, probably a little bit above average off to the north and east. Obviously, the soil moisture is sopping wet, soggy out there now, but we'll see how that kind of drains out. And then a little bit drier than average, probably down southwest Rio Grande Plains, and maybe even down into South Texas, but not anything, like big drought years or anything like that. So kind of near normal for the most part across the area. And with that, I'll open it up to any questions we have, kind of short and sweet, with all this and kind of what everything we've been through and hopefully what we're heading for.
Well, Jeff, as always, thank you very much for the update. For those that are on, if you want to review this again, I'll upload it to YouTube, and I'm going to stop recording.